Hi, I'm Kristen. Today's video is all about my first ever collage quilt. It's like a quilted wall hanging. So I kind of made it up as I went. I'd seen a few tutorials from other people, but maybe wasn't following them 100%. So this is not so much a tutorial of my own, so much as like a project journal, I guess. So I'm going to show you the steps I took, and I think it turned out really good. It's a wall hanging for a friend of mine, and it's based on her logo. So I started with a picture of her logo, which is like a bunch of different flowers, and then kind of took it from there. So if it's not a tutorial, why record it? Well, part of what this channel is about is just sort of recording the confident beginner experience, if you will. So just kind of illustrating that having a go sometimes, winging it a bit, nothing bad really happens, and you can turn out something quite good in the end, or something you're proud of. So even if you make little quote unquote mistakes that you maybe wouldn't do the second time or whatever, sometimes just getting right into it instead of getting in your head and going, I can't do it until I have this tool, or I need to learn this before I start, isn't always necessary. So that's what most of my videos are about, to be honest. But it's definitely what this one's about, because I just sort of went, I want to make this thing, let's just have a go. So I'll show you how I did it. So as I said, I started with my friend's logo. I basically copied the image on Safari, printed it at 300% on multiple pages, got rid of the extra white sheets that came out with it, and taped it together to make, I guess, a kind of a pattern or a guide of her logo, the size that I wanted it to be. This was the eventual background fabric that the piece of paper is sitting on right now, but I did also cut out a sort of cheap cotton to be sort of a backing for almost the applique piece, which is what it was going to end up being. So this is me pinning that cheap fabric on top of the printout. And then I've got this light box, and I'm going to start to trace all of the different shapes. I happen to have different colored fabric pens. I'll try and find a link to those, but you don't need that. You could do it in with black pens and then just sort of mark or keep a note somewhere of where the different colors are going to go, kind of thing. And you also don't need a light box. You could do this on a window. I'm having to shift this around because my, pattern, or whatever you call it, is bigger than the light box. But if you had it like on a sunny day taped up against a window, you could do the whole thing in one go, kind of thing. So I was initially, the drawing that I was doing it from, it does have lots of colors in it, and it also had lots of different shades of the colors. And I thought that maybe I could, do you see here, I'm sort of doing the outline of what I think is a darker orange or something. And I thought I could follow all those lines. That turned out to be a bit ambitious. So I sort of took a bit more artistic license in the end with the colors I used and everything. But for the tracing, that's why I'm kind of going to town with it like that. But basically, I'm just tracing the different shapes. There are patterns, like if you're interested in collage quilting, which is what I'm going to be doing on here after I'm done all the tracing, then there are folk who sell patterns, and what they do is kind of have shading of where the light and the dark and different values of fabric go, which isn't so much what I was doing here. I was just going sort of tracing where the different colors were, just to try and follow what it actually looked like, if that makes sense. I'm going to link in the description to some of the folk who do sell collage quilter patterns, as well as some of the handy quilter collage quilting videos that I watched as well. But this is basically how I started. I'm not going to show you all the tracing. I'll jump ahead a bit, but basically, once I had that whole outline done, I then cut away the excess white and was left with just the piece that I was going to then stroke quilt onto the background fabric. So this was a little bit fiddly, and this is not the way that I saw how to do on anybody else's tutorial. Basically, the other ways were either you buy a pattern that is printed onto a piece of backing fabric and you just use that as your backing fabric, or you kind of use Steam 2, which is a type of fusible. I'll talk about the fusibles in a little bit. And then you kind of do it onto some parchment. But whatever they were using to draw on the parchment, I couldn't figure it out. So this was the easiest way for me to just get going with it and not be going, oh, how do I do it with, how was she doing it? What was she using? So that's what I mean by not having to necessarily do it the way you see it on a video. If it doesn't make sense to you or it's stopping you from getting started, just do something else. Even if in my case, it's slightly more complicated, I guess. Once you have your pattern of whatever sort that is, the next step is to find some pieces of fabric and to pre-treat them with some sort of a fusible. What I'm going through there is a box of leftover fusible. So basically that's things that most of those were heat and bond that I had used for different applique projects, different quilts, and I just kept the leftovers. I wasn't sure quite what it was for, but anyway, this is what it turned out to be for. But I also did, in the course of this project, use some Steam 2 Light, which is the one that most of the folk who do collage quilts on a regular basis recommend, because it's kind of already got a sticky side before you even use an iron. So you can kind of stick it down in place and move it around a bit more. So it's a bit easier to work with. But I used a mix because I already had all of this stuff treated with heat and bond from previous projects. So I thought this was the perfect way to use some of it up. So I sorted it by color to start off with, and also to see what colors I was missing from the piece that I wanted to make. And those were the ones that I used the Steam 2 Light. I always say it wrong. So that was kind of my process in terms of that. So the other tools that I used was a pressing mat, obviously my iron. I did use baking parchment. That was more to protect the iron and the pressing mat than it was to temporarily stick the pieces on, which is what some other folk use it for. I also had 3 pairs of scissors. So I had 2 little small sharp ones and one for paper, because I was going to be cutting out, especially after I'd done it on the Steam 2, I was going to be cutting out pieces that had sort of a paper backing on it. And I didn't want to use my fabric scissors necessarily for that. So I used those 3 types of scissors. So this was just me adding little scraps that I had to the Steam 2 Light, because I found in my little piles of scraps that already had fusible on the back, I didn't really have much green. And obviously that logo with all the leaves and things needed lots of green. So I just tried to pick, whatever scraps I had in different volumes, is that the word? Yeah, the dark, medium, light thing. And I was trying to pick, just ones I thought would look nice with it. So I used a lot of batik scraps and things like that. And I was just kind of trying to fit it all in as best as I could. There was no rhyme or reason to this, really. And as I said, I did eventually cut this up into smaller chunks to actually use it. All that prep work, and then I was finally ready to start. So I did start with the greens, which are the ones treated with the Steam Light 2. So they were already pre-sticky, so I didn't need to use my iron to kind of put them in place. The first quote-unquote mistake or learning thing, I think, is that initially I was using pieces that were a bit small. I guess that's a choice, but it definitely made it take quite a bit longer. So I started using slightly bigger pieces once I got to the flowers and things like that. But for the leaves, which is where I started, I feel like I was using lots of fairly tiny pieces. It turned out looking fine, but just in terms of like this whole project took me longer than I kind of had anticipated it would, and it made a much bigger mess. I'll show you that in a little bit too. And again, so like, I suppose the questions I had when I was watching collage quilting videos and things was like, how do you know what to put where? And I guess you just don't. I was roughly going, well, those 2 big leaves in the logo are darker than the other ones. So I was using the slightly darker to medium fabrics in that one, and then more medium to light in the thinner leaves once I got to that point, if you know what I mean. And otherwise, I was just kind of winging it. I suppose once you get into it, you just sort of get into a flow, and I guess just don't think about it too much and just start placing things down You know, if you don't like it, you can always either peel it off or put something else on top or whatever. You know, it's not a big deal. So this is one of those ones where you kind of leave your second guessing at the door, I guess. And maybe that's part of why I like it a bit, of kind of like why I like improv quilting and stuff too. So I got bored of the green, so I jumped around to the orange a bit. It's still obviously not looking like much at this point. But I just started adding to whatever section I felt like. It took me several sessions, like of a few hours at a time, over several evenings to get this fully covered with little bits of fabric. I don't know how people do it that quickly, and it made such a mess. I was like tidying this stuff up for ages after. Look at the floor. This is peeled paper, bits of scrap. Oh my goodness. This was a time-consuming, messy project, but I really did have a lot of fun with it. So I'm not trying to put you off. I'm just sort of forewarned is forearmed, right? So yeah, so there's the flower taking shape. I guess I decided to focus on the orange and the yellow and black in the fabric of the flower, sorry. And then just sort of built it up from there. And it started to look like something eventually. And this was the finished piece and the mess before I put it onto the background. So the idea is that I was going to quilt the background first. So this is the background fabric loaded up on the Moxie. For the background, I did a sort of larger version of the square pebbles that I was doing in my first ever quilt on the Moxie, which was my video last week. So I basically just went round and round, sort of square rectangle shapes to make it almost like a brick wall looking thing. I didn't record myself stitching that because I was using like the same fabric as the backing, so I figured you probably couldn't really see it anyways. You obviously don't have to quilt the whole thing or where you're going to put the applique bit, which is what I keep calling it. But for me, that seemed like the easiest thing to do. So all I'm doing here is just sort of, I was kind of playing around with where's the throat space for the long arm and where do I want this centered. The backing is bigger than it needs to be. I made it quite a bit bigger than I needed it to be. And this is me trying to center it with my hands. And you do not need a long arm to do this. You could absolutely do this on your domestic. And this bit might actually be easier because you'd be able to just move it around and stuff. I used a micro foot for the quilting. I've never used one before. It was just because it's supposed to give you better vision of what you're doing, and I thought I was going to be doing some quite small, like stitching around some small areas, so I thought I'd give it a try. This is obviously me just picking out various thread colors. I changed my thread a lot for this because I wanted to use the same thread color as the little bits of fabric so that, you know, it was the collage bit that stood out and not so much the quilting, because I knew the quilting wasn't necessarily going to be all that. Now this bit I don't know that I would do again. So I basically tried to baste it down with some glue baste so that it didn't move, but I don't think it worked too well. Like, I don't think it stuck. Like, maybe I could use something else or leave it for longer before I started stitching, but really pins would have been fine. So I don't think that was necessary. Don't copy that bit. It was like, you can kind of see the theory, but yeah, I don't think it helped me. So I just started basically stitching around. I know you can't see too well here, but I've got various camera angles throughout this. It gets a bit better as I go on. I turned down lights halfway through. I'm still learning how to record on the Moxie, but for the leaves, I was trying roughly to do sort of organic leaf-like shapes, but I was really more interested in tacking down the raw edges, all of the raw edges. And once that was done, I was like, okay, let's add in a few more lines that make it look a bit like the veins of a leaf or something like that. And it was similar for the flowers and things like that. My main focus was just, let's make sure this whole thing is stitched down and none of these pieces come off in case any of my ironing or steaming or whatever wasn't 100%. So I was just going over all the various areas with my different thread colors. So I was changing the threads whenever it made sense. And I also learned how to do, you might have seen it if you do have a long arm, you might have seen it on some of the handy quilter videos where they kind of tie the thread and then they pull it through. I think I've got a clip of it later on in the video, but I was really impressed when that actually worked. So you didn't have to like totally rethread each thread color. But I really had fun with the quilting of this and with the, do you call it piecing? I guess you still call it piecing, the making the collage bit. So I think I would definitely do this again. I'm going to show you a few more angles of the quilting, but I do want to make a couple things clear. One, I have sped this up. So this isn't the actual speed I'm quilting. Also, you don't need any of the tools that I've necessarily got. Just because I'm using the micro quilter foot doesn't mean you need that one. You could use an open toe foot, and you could be doing this on your domestic machine. So don't focus on that. This, you can see me just now, where I've noticed like little holes in the collage. All I did was just on the long arm, add another bit that had the steam seam too on the back, and then quilt it right down. So it's no big deal if you don't get the whole thing covered, you miss something, you can still do that while you're at the quilting stage. And that happened in a few places, especially in the leaves where I had all those small pieces that were maybe too small. So that I needed to just kind of fill in a few areas as I was going on. And I think also there was a few around the, I think because this is around the edge, some of the time that was the outline of my tracing, because I'd used those big brightly colored markers. So that maybe was not ideal either, and not necessary, because I could have always referred back to the sort of source photo for the colors. I didn't really need the markers to be exactly the same size, if you know what I mean. Or same color, not the same size. You know what I'm talking about. Once I reached the edge of my throat space and done all the quilting I could do in there, this is me sort of taking the clamps off, not a great angle, but you can see it's a good angle for what you can see coming next, which is basically I'm releasing the backing and rolling forward the quilt top, or no, the take-up. I'm still learning the terminology. The take-up roll thingy at the back, and I've left the needle down so that the machine goes back with it, so that I can kind of judge how far I need to bring it to make sure I can get the rest of it into my throat space. So that was the easiest way I could find to do it for the size of project I was working on. I hope that made sense. Sorry, I don't know the terms of everything yet. So once I'd done that, I was able to just continue quilting the bottom of it. So at this point, the top of that piece would be inaccessible. So if I wanted to go back and do the top of those leaves at the very top, I would have to roll it again. But what I can do now in this position is do some sort of from the middle of the piece to the bottom, if that makes sense. So I did run into a little issue on the orange flower. I had a tension issue that I didn't notice right away. So I had to... I didn't have to, but I chose to unpick some threads and go back and do that again, which is again teaching me that I need to be paying attention and testing those threads on the side for tension every time, especially when I'm changing thread so many times. So this is me doing that handy quilter trick where you basically cut off the end of the thread you were just using, tie the thread of the new thread, and then pull from the needle, and it just kind of comes, if you pull it gently enough, it just kind of comes through. It's super cool. I was at like maybe 2 times out of 10, it broke on me and I still had to thread the last bit, but it still got through most of the other holes. So it was pretty cool. So again, it took me quite a few sessions to get this all quilted. I can't remember, probably less than it took me to make the actual collage, to be honest. That was definitely the longer bit of it. But this did take me a little bit. And if you are a long armor, can you have a look at the way my head is down like that? Should I have this long arm higher? I set it for the height that it said, for the height that I am, but I'm wondering if I'm sort of looking down too much. So anyway, if you have a long arm and you think I'm crouching and standing over a bit and my long arm should be higher, do let me know. I would love that feedback. So I think this was me on my last section here. As you can see, the thread is, through the magic of editing, the thread has turned to green. So this is the last few leaves. But once I had that all finished, I did have a look over it again and ended up going back with a few of the other thread colors to kind of go over a few areas where maybe I'd missed a raw edge or something like that. So I did go back and do some checking before I finally decided it was well and truly quilted. So when I was sure it was all done, unrolled rolled it kind of from the frame, unpinned it obviously, and then I did have to trim it down because I had, as I said, made the backing much bigger than what I actually wanted the wall hanging to be, just so that I wasn't caught short, if you know what I mean. So this was it before I trimmed it, and this is the back, a few funny threads, but mostly looks okay. And that's the dowel that I was using to hang it, so obviously I needed to trim off and sort of center it. So these are some close-ups of the collage. I'm pretty happy with it, I've got to say. For a first time, I was pretty chuffed. So I think this is a pretty forgiving technique, I guess. And I'm usually pretty self-critical, so that's saying a lot. Now this is it, finally finished. The dowel's in the back. I did face it, if you've heard of that, but I didn't do the hand sewing. So this is my kind of cheats method of facing. I might put that in a future video if anyone's interested, but I thought this video was getting too long to put that in here. So, so this is how it turned out. And then I just popped it in a poster tube, rolled it all up, and sent it off to the recipient. So hoping that she likes it. She should get it either the day this video comes out or the day after. I don't think she watches every video, so I don't think I'm giving away any big secrets. She'll get it really soon regardless. Thanks so much for watching. If you like videos like this and you're not already subscribed, please do. Leave me a comment, let me know what you thought, and I hope to see you again. Bye.